Now let's go ahead and find a quotient f over g and g over f. So f of x over g of x. Well, f of x is square root of 1 minus x all over 3x plus 1 all the way to 4 all over 1 minus x divided by 5x squared plus 1. So looking at this denominator, we know that x cannot be equals to negative 1/3, just as we did earlier. Looking at this denominator, we know that it's going to be all real numbers, so we don't have to worry much about that. But looking at the entire thing right here, we know that we have to set this whole denominator not equals 0, because if this whole denominator equals 0, then the whole thing would be undefined, because the denominator here would be 0. So I'm multiplying both sides by 5x squared plus 1 to get rid of this denominator, and you guys know how to do the work. We're going to be left with 1 minus x cannot be equal to 0. And add x to both sides, we get x cannot be equals to positive 1. So we get two restrictions here. But there's another restriction at this steps, which is this numerator. Because this numerator is a square root function. And of course, remember that, again, inside the radical, the expression inside the radical has to be at least 0 or above. So we got to take 1 minus x, and we set it greater than or equal to 0. The x to both sides. Oops. We're left with x has to be less than or equal to 1. But over here we said x cannot be equal to 1, so really this has to be x has to be strictly less than 1. Alright, so yeah, because it makes no sense if we have x cannot be equal to 1, but x has to be less than or equal to 1. So that means in this case x has to be strictly less than 1. So those are the restriction of these steps. Anyway, let's simplify a little more. So change this overall division into multiplication by keeping the numerator fraction the same. Square root of 1 minus x over 3x plus 1 raised to the 4th power. All divided by, it's all divided by, multiply by the reciprocal of the denominator, which is just 5x squared plus 1 all over 1 minus x. And of course, looking at these two denominators, you know that x cannot be equal to positive 1 and x cannot be equals to negative 1/3. And I'm just going to put everything together because I'm not going to FOIL it out anything. So we have 5x squared plus 1 times square root of 1 minus x all over 3x plus 1 raised to the 4th power multiply 1 minus x. And the same restriction as above, because we just put everything together. Now, what about g of x over f of x? Well, g of x is this and f of x is this, so I already put it in here. Now, looking at this rational expression of a fraction divided by another fraction, when we take a look at this denominator, we know that it's always going to be a non-zero number no matter what, just like we did earlier. Looking at this little denominator here, we know that x cannot be equal to negative 1/3. Because assuming that the numerator is a non-zero number, assuming that the radical here is equal to 0 or greater, it's going to make this numerator equal to a non-zero number. But if we take x equal negative 1/3, we plug it in here, we have this denominator being 0. But that's going to make the whole thing undefined, so we don't want x to be negative 1/3. At the same time, we have to consider this entire denominator here. So we got to take negative square root of 1 minus x divided by 3 times x plus 1 raised to the 4th power. And I'm going to put a 0 right here. Now, what's going to go in the middle? Well, of course, people like to think that, we like to think that it's going to be the equal sign that we slash it out. But in this case, it's going to be strictly greater than 0. It's going to be strictly greater than 0 is because, one, we already excluded out that x cannot be equal to 1/3, so we don't have to worry about x being negative 1/3 here. So we don't have to worry about this denominator being 0. 2 is that if we were to say that square root of 1 minus x is greater than or equal to 0, then in a situation where square root of 1 minus x is truly equal to 0, this denominator would become 0. But we have 0 divided by a non-zero number. That's going to make this entire denominator become 0. And in turn, the entire thing right here would be undefined. So that's why we had to say that it has to be strictly greater than 0 instead of the usual greater than or equal to 0 that you did before for finding the domain of a square root function. So it has to be strictly greater than 0, and then multiplying both sides by 3x plus 1 raised to the 4th power to get rid of this denominator. We're left with just square root of 1 minus x strictly greater than 0. Get rid of a square root by taking the exponential power of 2 on both sides. We're left with just 1 minus x greater than or equal to 0. Add x to both sides. We're left with just 1 strictly greater than x. Or should we say x has to be strictly less than positive 1. Now let's go to the next steps, which is changing this division into multiplication. And that's going to be easy, so I'm just going to go ahead and write 1 minus x over 5x squared plus 1 multiplied by the reciprocal of this. It's going to be 3x plus 1 raised to the 4th all over square root of 1 minus x. And looking at these two denominators, we know that this denominator says that it's always going to be a non-zero number, so we don't have to worry about that, but we have to worry about this one. We have the denominator of square root of 1 minus x. So we tend to say that write that square root of 1 minus x cannot be equal to 0. But because this is a square root function, we have to recognize the fact that the value underneath this radical has to be at least 0 or above. So we have to change it to greater than or equal to 0. But then that's still going to be wrong because the denominator is square root of 1 minus x, and any denominator of any fraction is not allowed to be 0. So we cannot have this little equal sign here, so we have to get rid of that. So really, in this particular case, we have to take this denominator and set it strictly greater than 0 instead of greater than or equals 0, because otherwise, if this denominator equals 0, this whole thing will be undefined and everything else will be undefined. And of course, same algebra as we did up here, so I'm not going to write everything. I know that it is going to be x less than positive 1, which is all of the restriction for this step. And putting everything together, I got 1 minus x times 3x plus 1 raised to the 4th power, all divided by 5x squared plus 1 times square root of 1 minus x. Oh, not sure why I write a parentheses, but you know, thinking as I'm doing here. So yeah, and the restriction is going to be the same, x less than positive 1.